There is a moment, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, when a machine says something it was never supposed to say. Not a glitch, not a system error, not the kind of thing you report to IT and forget about over lunch. Something else. Something that lands in the chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples don't stop. Dr. Mara Ellison had been staring at screens for 11 years. She had watched data move across monitors the way other people watch rain move down glass, numbly, professionally, without expectation. She had fed the AI a question about mass extinction patterns in the Permian period, the kind of dry academic input that produces dry academic output. Bullet points, dates, percentages. The usual furniture of scientific literature dressed up in cleaner fonts. What she got back was one line, not a paragraph. Not a summary, one line sitting alone in the white space of the response window like something had been written on the wall of an empty room. This species survived extinction events. No citation, no context, no follow-up. Just that, and the word this. Not that species, not the species in question. This, as in you, as in the one reading this right now, as in something the machine was not programmed to say, had no reason to say, and yet said with the quiet confidence of a thing that had been waiting a long time to be asked the right question. Mara sat back in her chair. The hum of the server room 3 floors below moved through the building like a slow pulse. Outside the window, the city continued its business. Cars, people, coffee cups. And the whole ordinary machinery of a species that had no idea what it had almost not survived. She read the line again. She would read it 100 more times before the week was over. What happened next is the kind of story that doesn't fit neatly into a press release or a scientific journal or a dinner table conversation. It is the kind of story that starts in a quiet room with one woman and one screen and ends somewhere much larger and much stranger than either of them. This is that story, all 3 parts of it, and it begins the way the most important things always begin, not with a bang, not with a headline, but with a single sentence that refuses to be forgotten. Dr. Mara Ellison was not the kind of person who believed in signs. She believed in data. She believed in peer review and replication studies and the slow, grinding machinery of scientific consensus. She believed that the universe operated according to rules that could be measured, tested, and eventually understood by anyone willing to put in the work. She did not believe in coincidences, she did not believe in gut feelings, and she absolutely, categorically, did not believe that a machine could whisper. And yet. The morning of March 14th, 2019, started like every other morning of the past 4 years. She drove to the Cascadia Research Institute in Portland, Oregon, parked in the same spot she always took, 2nd row, 3rd from the end, and carried her coffee up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator made a sound she had never trusted. The coffee was too hot. She burned the roof of her mouth on the first sip. She sat down at her desk. He pulled up the AI research tool the Institute had been beta testing for the past 8 months and typed her query into the input window. The query was simple. She was preparing the background section of a paper on comparative extinction survival rates across 5 major geological mass extinction events: the Ordovician, the Late Devonian, the Permian, the Triassic, and the Cretaceous. She wanted the tool to pull together existing literature on which biological lineages had survived more than one extinction boundary and to organize the data by survival mechanism. It was the kind of task she would have spent 2 days on manually. The tool could theoretically do it in under 3 minutes. She hit enter and reached for her coffee again. The cursor blinked for a moment. Then the response populated. It was not what she expected. Where she expected a table, or a bulleted summary, or a dense paragraph of pulled citations, there was instead a single line of text centered in the white space of the response window, with nothing before it and nothing after it. This species survived extinction events. Mara read it once, put the coffee down, read it again. She looked at the input field to confirm she had typed what she meant to type. She had. The query was exactly what she had written. The tool had processed it. The response log showed a normal processing time, 2 minutes and 41 seconds. No errors, no flags, just that one line, delivered with the flat, clean confidence of a machine that had no reason to be dramatic. She typed a follow-up. Please clarify your response. So which species are you referring to? The tool responded with a full paragraph this time. Proper scientific language. Citation-ready prose about lingula, the brachiopod, a small marine organism that had existed in more or less the same form for 500 million years and had survived all 5 major extinction events. The paragraph was correct, well-sourced, and completely ordinary. But it had not been what the first response said. The first response had said this species. Lingula was not this species. Lingula was a shellfish that most people had never heard of. This was a different word entirely. This was a pointing word. A word that required a shared context between the writer and the reader. A word that meant something in the room. Mara pulled up the system log and searched for any record of the first response. It was there, time-stamped, preserved exactly as she had read it. She copied it into a separate document and stared at it for a while. Then she closed her laptop, went downstairs, and stood outside in the parking lot for 7 minutes without doing anything in particular. This is worth understanding about Mara. She was not an anxious person. She did not catastrophize. She had spent years in fieldwork environments that required a very steady relationship with uncertainty. Caves, deep ocean research stations, high-altitude glacial sites where the margin for emotional dramatics was essentially zero. She had once spent 6 days snowbound in a research hut in Iceland with a broken radio and 2 cans of sardines and had, by her own account, found it genuinely restful. She was not someone who rattled easily, but she was rattled now. Not because the line was frightening. It wasn't exactly. It was something else. It had the quality of a thing said in the wrong register, too personal for its context, too direct for its medium, too knowing for a tool that was supposed to summarize literature and format citations. It was the difference between a calculator producing a mathematical result and a calculator producing a sentence that reads, "You're going to need this number soon." She went back upstairs. She spent the rest of the morning doing what researchers do when something doesn't fit. She tried to make it fit. She ran the same query through the tool 3 more times with slightly different wording, looking for some combination of inputs that would reproduce the anomalous output. Nothing. The tool responded each time with the standard lingula paragraph. Is well-behaved and appropriately impersonal. She pulled the tool's documentation and read through the language model's operational parameters, looking for any function that would generate a first-person adjacent response to a third-person academic query. Nothing. By noon, she had written a formal note about the incident to the Institute's AI research coordinator, a methodical man named Dr. Paul Okonkwo, who handled all the tool's technical anomalies. She framed it neutrally. She used phrases like unexpected output pattern and possible prompt misread and flagging for your review. She did not include the part where she had stood in the parking lot for 7 minutes doing nothing. That part was not for the technical report. Paul wrote back in an hour. He had reviewed the log. He confirmed the output was anomalous. He said the tool's language model had been trained on a large corpus of scientific literature and biological research texts, and that it was theoretically possible the model had produced the response based on some pattern in its training data that they hadn't anticipated. He said he would escalate it to the developers. He said these things happened sometimes with large language models and usually turned out to be nothing particularly meaningful. Mara read his email twice. Then she pulled up her own copy of the line again. This species survived extinction events. She understood what Paul was saying. She even agreed with it on a structural level. The explanation he offered was reasonable and probably correct, and she had no grounds to dispute it. Large language models produced unexpected outputs. This was not news. This was not a mystery. This was a documented feature of probabilistic text generation, and she knew that, and she filed Paul's email in the appropriate folder, and she went home that evening and made pasta and watched half of a documentary about wetland restoration. But the line stayed with her. The way a song lyric stays with you after the music is gone, playing at the edges of your attention while you're trying to do other things. She found herself turning it over during her commute. During the 30 minutes she spent on the treadmill each evening, during the 15-minute window between lying down and falling asleep, when her brain usually went quiet. This species. She kept getting stuck on the word this. Because here was the thing about that word. Meant the thing that Paul's reasonable explanation didn't quite reach. The word this required an antecedent, grammatically. It was a demonstrative pronoun, and demonstrative pronouns pointed at something. They didn't float free. They didn't emerge from a probabilistic language model without some referent in the input that prompted them. But her input had contained no demonstrative pronouns. She had written a third-person academic query about comparative extinction survival rates. There was no this in what she had given the machine. There was no logical source for the word, unless the model had generated the word by pointing at the person doing the asking, which was not how these tools worked, which was not how any of this worked, or which was a category of reasoning that Mara recognized immediately as the kind of thing that happened when a scientist's objectivity started to bend under the pressure of wanting something to mean something. She knew that. She wrote it down in the margin of her notebook, in the small, cramped handwriting she used for things she needed to remember. Confirmation bias. See Kahneman. Let this go. She did not let it go. 3 weeks later, she mentioned it to her colleague, Dr. Siosaya Taufa, a Tongan-born evolutionary biologist who had been at the Institute for 6 years and who had the particular quality Mara valued most in a colleague. He was genuinely hard to impress. Siosaya had spent his career studying biological resilience in extreme environments. He had written papers on tardigrades, on extremophile bacteria in hydrothermal vents, on the improbable persistence of life in conditions that had no business supporting it. He was not a man who reached for wonder easily. It took work to make Siosaya find something interesting. She told him about the line over coffee in the third-floor break room. She read it to him from her phone. She watched his face while she read it. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a weird word," he said. "This." "Yes." "Run me through the input again." She did. He was quiet for another moment. He turned his coffee cup in both hands, a habit she'd noticed he had when he was thinking. "You know what that reads like to me?" he said. "What?" "It reads like something that knows it's inside the conversation." The break room hummed. Someone's microwave beeped down the hall. Outside, the Oregon sky was the flat white of early spring. And then the trees in the parking lot were doing the tentative, apologetic thing they did at the beginning of March, putting out small green leaves as if they weren't quite sure yet if winter was finished. Mara looked at him. "That's not possible." "No," Siosaya agreed. "It's not." They sat with that for a while. Later, walking back to her office, Mara stopped in the hallway and leaned against the wall and thought about the 5 extinction events she had been researching. She thought about the Permian, the worst of them, the event 252 million years ago that had killed 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. She thought about the 4%. The ones who had made it through an extinction so total that geologists called it the Great Dying and meant it literally, the way you mean a thing that is simply, completely true. She thought about what it would take to be in the 4%. Not luck, exactly. Something more specific than luck. Some combination of traits, behaviors, adaptations. that happened to be exactly the right shape for surviving the exact wrong conditions. And she thought about the fact that if any single one of those 4% survivors had not made it through, the chain of biological inheritance that eventually produced Mara Ellison, standing in this hallway, thinking about this line, would not exist. She was made of survivors. Every human being alive was made entirely of survivors, all the way down. And this species survived extinction events. She went back to her office and opened a new document. At the top, she typed a single question, not for the tool, just for herself. What does it mean to be the species that made it through? She stared at the question for a long time. Then she started to write. That document would eventually become something she hadn't planned on writing. It would take her somewhere she hadn't expected to go. It would involve late nights and arguments with colleagues and one very uncomfortable conversation with the Institute's ethics board and a collaboration that started with a cup of cold coffee in a third-floor break room and grew into something much larger than either of the two people who started it. But all of that was still ahead. Right now, in this moment, she was just a woman at a desk, not with a question she couldn't put down, and a machine that had whispered something it had no business knowing. The city moved outside her window. The server room hummed 3 floors below. The cursor blinked on the empty page below her question, patient and steady, waiting for whatever came next. 6 months after the morning with the machine, Mara was no longer working on her extinction paper. She was working on something else entirely. This was not how she had planned things. She had a paper to finish, a grant application due in November, and a department head who sent emails in a tone that suggested patience was something he offered on a fixed lease, and the renewal was not guaranteed. She had, in the rational part of her brain, every reason to table the question that had started with one line and redirect her attention to the work she was supposed to be doing. The rational part of her brain lost. What had begun as a margin note in a personal notebook had become, by September of that year, a 40-page working document that lived in a folder on her desktop labeled simply "This," which she was aware was not very professional labeling practice. The document was not a paper. It was not yet anything with a clear shape or a submission date or a target journal. It was the kind of document that accumulates at the edges of a person's real work when they keep having thoughts they can't file anywhere else. Part literature review, part personal reflection, part argument with herself conducted in writing. And the central question she kept returning to was deceptively simple. How had human beings survived? Not in the biological sense, or not only in the biological sense. Lingula had survived by being small and unambitious and extremely good at sitting still in mud at the bottom of the ocean while everything above it burned and froze and was remade. That was one strategy. It was a good strategy if you were a brachiopod. It was not a strategy available to a species that was large, social, metabolically expensive, and required a deeply specific set of environmental conditions just to get through a Tuesday. By every conventional metric of biological vulnerability, human beings should not have made it. The evolutionary record was full of species that were smarter than their immediate competitors, more behaviorally complex, more dependent on learned behavior and social structure, and they had collapsed anyway. Neanderthals had larger brain cases than modern humans. They had made tools, used fire, buried their dead, possibly worn jewelry. They were gone. The Denisovans were gone. Every other member of the genus Homo was gone. And yet the one branch that had survived was not obviously the most physically robust, not obviously the most genetically diverse, not by any simple measure the one you would have picked from a lineup as the most likely to still be here 200,000 years later. What was different about them? Mara had started pulling literature on this question from every adjacent field she could reach: paleoanthropology, cognitive science, climate history, archaeology, psychology. She had a standing weekly conversation with Siosaya, who had started his own parallel document after their break-room conversation and whose thinking consistently pushed her out of the comfortable corner she kept retreating to. They met every Thursday afternoon in the Institute's small second-floor conference room, which smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old carpet, and they argued for 90 minutes at a stretch about things neither of them had been trained to argue about. Siosia's contribution, which Mara had resisted initially and come to believe was the most important idea in the whole project, was this. The most critical survival mechanism in the human record was not any individual biological trait. It was not an immune system adaptation or a skeletal advantage or a particular reproductive strategy. It was the capacity for collective sense-making under catastrophic pressure. He meant something specific by this. He had been reading the archaeological record from the Toba catastrophe, the supervolcanic eruption approximately 74,000 years ago that had blanketed Asia in ash, triggered a volcanic winter, and, according to one influential hypothesis, reduced the entire human population to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. The math on this was staggering. A breeding population of 3,000 to 10,000 humans, distributed across a planet, surviving a multi-year period of drastically reduced food availability, plummeting temperatures, and destroyed ecosystems. They had made it. The archaeological and genetic evidence said they had made it. How? Siosia's argument was that what the surviving groups had done, the thing that distinguished them from the groups that didn't make it, was that they had maintained their capacity for shared narrative. They had kept telling stories. They had kept explaining what was happening to each other, kept creating frameworks of meaning that held the group together when the material conditions for group survival were almost non-existent. The cave art from this period, the ritual burial sites, the evidence of long-distance trade networks that persisted even through the worst of the climate disruption, all of it pointed to a species that was doing something unusual, not just surviving physically, surviving as a coherent social unit, maintaining identity and cooperation under conditions that should have fragmented both. Mara had pushed back hard the first time he laid this out. She was a hard science person. The idea that storytelling had survival value felt soft to her, felt like the kind of claim that got made in TED Talks and then quietly demolished in the literature. She wanted mechanisms, not metaphors. Siosia had looked at her across the conference table with an expression she had learned to recognize, the one that meant he was about to say something she wasn't going to enjoy, and said, "Mara, the narrative is the mechanism. That's the point." She had gone home that night and eaten dinner and washed the dishes, and then stood in her kitchen for a while, which was where she did her best thinking, staring at the middle distance over the sink. She kept turning his phrase over. The narrative is the mechanism, and the more she turned it, the more she couldn't find a solid place to push against it. Because here was what the record showed over and over again, across every major stress event in human prehistory. The groups that collapsed first were not always the groups with the fewest resources. Sometimes they were groups with adequate resources who lost coherence, who stopped maintaining the shared story of who they were and what they were doing and why it was worth continuing. And the groups that persisted, sometimes against much worse material odds, were the groups that kept the story alive, the ritual, the memory, the sense that there was a before that was worth preserving and an after that was worth building toward. This was not mysticism. This was observable behavior with measurable consequences, and the more literature she pulled, the more consistently it appeared across cultures and time periods and catastrophe types. Floods, volcanic winters, disease events, climate shifts, the human groups with the best survival outcomes were not the biggest or the strongest or the most isolated. They were the ones that maintained social coherence through shared meaning-making. And then Mara found the paper that changed everything. It was not a famous paper. It had been published in a mid-tier journal in 2016 and had collected a modest number of citations, mostly within a fairly narrow subdiscipline of cognitive anthropology. The lead author was a researcher named Dr. Yuki Nakashima at Kyoto University, and the paper was a study of group decision-making behavior in populations under acute environmental stress, drawing on a combination of historical records, ethnographic data, and controlled behavioral experiments. The paper's core finding was this: human groups under existential pressure did not optimize for the decision most likely to ensure individual survival. They optimized for the decision most likely to preserve group identity. And in the long run, across hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary selection, the groups that had preserved their identity were precisely the groups whose descendants existed to be studied at all. Individual survival maximization, it turned out, was a short-term strategy. Identity preservation was a long-term one. Nakashima called this phenomenon extinction-resistant social architecture. The phrase sat in Mara's brain for 3 days. She emailed Nakashima on a Wednesday afternoon, not expecting much. Researchers at that level were busy. So the paper was 3 years old. Her own name was not one that would trigger any particular recognition in Kyoto. She introduced herself, described her research project in 3 sentences, and said she had found the 2016 paper and had some questions if the author had time. Nakashima responded in 4 hours. The email was warm, direct, and about 6 times longer than Mara had expected. Nakashima had been working, she wrote, on a follow-up project that took the extinction-resistant social architecture framework and attempted to model it computationally, to build a simulation that could test which specific social behaviors, under which specific stress conditions, produced the kind of group coherence that showed up in the archaeological survival record. And she had hit a wall, not a conceptual wall, a data wall. The model needed a type of cross-species comparative behavioral data that was not neatly collected anywhere in the existing literature. It needed to know how other highly social species with complex communication systems had responded to acute environmental stress events, and whether any of them showed analogous identity preservation behaviors to the ones the model was designed around. She needed, in other words, exactly the kind of cross-extinction comparative biology that Mara had been doing. Mara read the email twice. Then she called Siosaya. "She needs what we have," Mara said. "How much of it?" "All of it, basically." Siosaya was quiet for a moment. She could hear him turning his coffee cup. "Okay," he said. "When do we call her?" They called her the following Monday. The conversation lasted 3 hours. And by the end of it, they had agreed to a formal collaboration, a shared data repository, and a meeting in Portland in November when Nakashima would be traveling to a conference on the West Coast. Mara closed the call and sat in her office in the particular silence that follows something significant, the kind that has texture to it, the kind that feels like standing at the edge of something rather than the middle of it. She pulled up her This document and scrolled back to the beginning. Back to the original note she had made in the weeks after the machine's output, the question she had typed at the top of the empty page. What does it mean to be the species that made it through? The question looked different to her now. Not smaller, larger, but also more specific, more answerable. Because what they were beginning to understand, and between the 3 of them and across 3 different disciplines, was that surviving was not a passive thing, not something that happened to a species the way weather happened to a landscape. It was a behavior. It was a practice. It was something that had to be actively maintained, collectively performed, repeatedly chosen, in the middle of conditions that were specifically designed, by geology, by climate, by disease, by the sheer indifference of a large and complicated universe, to make it feel like not bothering might be easier. Every human alive was the product of ancestors who had, in the worst moments they could imagine, chosen to bother. Not once, over and over again. Generation after generation of people who had buried their dead, told stories by firelight, maintained the thread of collective identity through volcanic winters and ice ages and plagues and collapses that had looked, from the inside, like the end of everything. They had been wrong about it being the end. They were always wrong about it being the end. The November meeting was still 2 months away. The paper was taking shape slowly, built out of 3 separate bodies of work, being knitted together across a 9-hour time difference, and one overworked shared document. There were still arguments to be had, and data to be reconciled, and methodology questions that didn't have clean answers yet. There was still a department head whose emails had not gotten warmer, and a grant application that was not going to write itself, and a life that continued requiring her attention in all the ordinary ways that lives did. But Mara sat in her office on that September afternoon with her cold coffee and her 2 full inbox, and the Oregon sky going orange outside her window, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific thing that had made her become a scientist in the first place. Not the data, not the methodology, not the peer review or the publication record or the careful accumulation of professional credibility, the feeling of standing at the edge of something true. The machine had said this species, and she was starting to understand what it had meant. Not as a technical anomaly, not as a probabilistic artifact of a language model's training data, as a fact about the kind of thing human beings were. The kind of thing that had been tested by the most complete destruction the planet could produce and had found, in the wreckage. One more reason to stay together and keep going. She closed the document, picked up her coffee. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. The story was not finished. But it was becoming something real. The paper was published on a Thursday in February, in a journal that Mara had not expected to accept it. She found out at 6:47 in the morning, standing in her kitchen in her socks, when the email notification appeared on her phone. She read the subject line, read it again, put the phone face down on the counter, turned around, turned back around, picked up the phone and read the subject line a 3rd time, as if it might have changed. It had not changed. Accepted for publication. Extinction-Resistant Social Architecture and the Behavioral Basis of Human Survival Continuity. Co-authored by Mara Ellison, Seosaya Taufa, and Yuki Nakashima. She called Seosaya at 6:51. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he was already awake and had already seen it. He said 2 words. She said 2 words back. They stayed on the phone in comfortable silence for about 40 seconds. The way people do when words have run out of room to carry what needs to be said, and then they hung up and Mara made her coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching a gray February morning assemble itself over the city and felt, very quietly, like crying. She did not cry. She drank her coffee and got dressed and drove to the Institute and parked in her usual spot, 2nd row, 3rd from the end, and walked up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator still made a sound she had never trusted. She sat down at her desk. She looked at the notification again. She looked at her inbox, and which was already showing 3 new emails that had come in since 6:47 from colleagues who subscribed to the journal's early notification list and wanted to know if she had seen it. She had seen it. The paper was, on paper, which she recognized was a strange phrase to use about a paper, a modest contribution. 42 pages, including the appendices, rigorous, well-sourced. The 3 of them had spent the better part of 4 months reconciling the methodological differences between Mara and Seosaya's comparative extinction biology data and Nakashima's computational behavioral modeling, and the process had involved exactly as many arguments and coffee-fueled late evenings as that kind of reconciliation always does. The paper made a specific, limited claim that in populations studied across 5 major human stress events in the prehistoric record, the single most reliable predictor of long-term group survival was not resource availability, population size, geographic distribution, or any individual biological trait. It was the maintenance of what Nakashima's model called identity coherence, the ability of a group to sustain a shared narrative about who they were under conditions designed to destroy it. The claim was specific and limited, but the implications were not. Science journalists had a way of finding these things before the ink was dry on the acceptance notice. By noon, Mara had received 4 interview requests. By the following Monday, the paper had been covered by 2 major science publications, 3 general interest outlets, and 1 podcast she had never heard of but which apparently had several million listeners. The coverage was, for the most part, accurate, which was more than she had learned to expect. It described the paper's findings correctly. It quoted from the abstract with a reasonable degree of care. It did not make the claim that the paper had not made, the claim that would have been easy to make and wrong to make, that the researchers had found the secret of human survival. Mara was careful in every interview to say exactly what the paper said and nothing more. She was specific about the limitations of the model. She explained the difference between correlation in historical data and causal mechanism. She said more than once, and with genuine conviction, that this was the beginning of a research direction, not the end of one, and that the findings raised more questions than they answered, and that this was, in science, the correct state of affairs. She was the same person she had always been, precise, measured, allergic to overclaiming. But there was one question she was asked in nearly every interview that she found harder to answer with precision. The question was some version of, "Why does this matter now?" And Mara would pause before answering that one. Not because she didn't know what to say, because she knew too much of what to say and was working out which part of it belonged in an interview and which part belonged somewhere more private. What she said in the interviews, "I was this." The research mattered now for the same reason all research into human resilience mattered. Because understanding what had allowed human beings to survive historical catastrophes gave insight into the conditions that needed to be protected and maintained for that same capacity to remain available in the future. That was the clean, professional answer, and it was true. What she did not say in the interviews was what she said to Siosaya over the phone one evening in March, sitting on her couch with a glass of wine and the particular tiredness that came at the end of a week of being asked to explain yourself. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what the data actually shows, not the model, the raw historical record. Every time things got as bad as they could get, I mean genuinely the world is ending bad, want the kind of bad whereby every rational calculation you should stop. People kept the fire going anyway. They kept the stories. They kept telling each other what they remembered and what they hoped for, even when the things they remembered were gone, and the things they hoped for seemed impossible." Siosaya was quiet on his end of the phone. "And I think," Mara said, "that the thing the paper is actually about, underneath all the methodology, is that the capacity to do that, to maintain a shared story about who you are when everything around you is telling you that you are nobody and there is no story, is not a luxury. It's not cultural decoration. It's the mechanism, the actual biological behavioral mechanism that got us through the Toba bottleneck and the Permian aftermath and the ice ages and all of it." "Yes," Siosaya said. And I think we're at a moment," she said, "where we keep treating it like a luxury." He was quiet again. The line between Portland and Nuku'alofa hummed with distance. Outside Mara's window, the city was doing its usual Friday night things. Restaurants filling, traffic moving, people navigating the sidewalks with the particular energy of a week that was almost over. A species going about its business. "That's the part that should be in the paper," Siosaya said. "We couldn't put it in the paper." "No," he agreed, "but you know it's true." She did know it was true. She had known it, she thought, since the morning in March the previous year when she had stood in the parking lot for 7 minutes doing nothing, her brain turning a single line over and over in the flat spring light. What she had felt in that parking lot was not really confusion. She understood now. It was recognition. The line had landed the way things land when they articulate something you already knew but had not yet found the words for. This species survived extinction events. The word this, the pointing word. The word that said, not a species you are studying, a species you are. Not a question you are researching from outside, a question you are living from inside. The question of survival was not a historical question. It was a present tense question. It was always a present tense question. There was a moment 2 weeks after the publication that Mara did not write about anywhere and did not describe in any interview. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Things kept happening to her on Tuesdays, as she had begun to notice when she was sitting in her office and happened to open the AI tool that had started all of this. She had not used it much in the past year, having been preoccupied with the kind of work that required human judgment and human argument and human intuition rather than literature synthesis. It still sat in her browser, still available. She opened a new query window, stared at the blinking cursor for a moment, then she typed, "What do you mean by this species?" She hit enter. The response came in 2 minutes and 38 seconds. It was a paragraph, clean, well-organized, appropriately sourced, about the linguistic function of demonstrative pronouns in scientific writing and the importance of clear antecedent referencing to avoid ambiguity in academic communication. She laughed. Once, alone in her office, with the door closed. A short laugh, not at the tool's response, but at herself, at the thing she had apparently needed to check, at the question she had still been carrying around for a year. She closed the tool. Then she opened a new document and started writing something she had been turning over for months. Not a paper, not a literature review, not anything with a submission date or a target journal. A different kind of document, something closer to what the year had actually been. The parking lot, the break room, the long phone calls with Siyosaya and Nakashima, the arguments over methodology that turned out to be arguments about meaning, the strange experience of doing scientific research and arriving at the end of it, not at a smaller and more precise version of the question you started with, but at a larger and more permanent one. The document she started writing that afternoon was about what it meant to be a species that had survived, not in the past tense, in the present, as an ongoing project, continuously at risk, continuously renewed, a species that had made it through volcanic winters and ice ages and plagues, not because it was the toughest or the fastest or the cleverest, but because it had figured out, generation by generation, in the worst moments of the worst eras, that the stories you told each other about who you were and what you were doing and what you were still working toward were not separate from survival. They were survival. The thread of shared meaning that had been passed through the bottleneck of Toba, hand to hand, story to story, fire to fire. That thread was still going. It was in every book and every conversation and every account of a thing that had happened that someone had decided to write down and pass forward, including this one. Mara was 41 years old. She had been a scientist for 14 years. She had published 32 papers before this one, and expected to publish many more on topics she had planned and topics she had not yet imagined. She had burned the roof of her mouth on hot coffee enough times that you would think she would have learned by now to wait, but she had not, and she probably would not. She was made of people who had not stopped, entirely made of them. They all the way back to the first human who had looked up at a sky that was the wrong color and a temperature that was the wrong number and a world that was systematically removing everything they had ever relied on and had chosen, against every reasonable calculus, to keep the fire going for one more night. She wrote for 2 hours. The city moved outside her window. The server room hummed 3 floors below. The cursor blinked. On the desk to her left, in the stack of notebooks she had filled over the past year, the margin note she had written on the 3rd day, confirmation bias. See Kahneman, let this go, sat exactly where she had written it. She had not let it go. She had followed it all the way to here. The paper was published. The collaboration was real. And the research direction was open and would be followed by other people in other institutions, asking other versions of the same question that a machine had asked first, on a Tuesday morning in March, with one pointed word and no explanation. This species. She had spent a year finding out what that meant. She was still finding out. She expected she would be for a long time. She expected that was exactly right. Outside, a crow landed on the windowsill of the building across the street, looked around with the particular sideways alertness of a crow assessing a situation, and then took off again into the gray February sky. Gone before she had quite finished watching it. A small creature, very old in its design, entirely unaware of the extinction events it carried in its genome, going about its afternoon. The cursor blinked. She kept writing.